Hi, everyone. Thanks for a great job on your work on Matthew 9:35 to 11:1. I wanted to go over my own work with you to give you an example. Some of you have been asking for some examples and such. And here is a survey and an interpretation that I did. I've also embedded some instructions. But let's start with, again, start off with survey. So you want to look for an outline of this. And this passage is not the easiest one to break down. I think the clearest markers of structure are the opening paragraph 9:35 to 38. That's clearly a case of Jesus talking about the need. And then chapter 10 is Jesus essentially filling the need by sending his disciples out. You may also have noticed and observed structure-wise that 9:35, 11:1 are similar. So we have a sort of a framework around this. You may also have recalled that if you go back to 4:23 and 24:25, then chapter 4 is going to be the same as 9:35 and 11:1. So we have these frameworks around Jesus's ministry and then around the ministry of his disciples. So this essentially breaks into two pieces. I've called the first section the needy world, where we see, again, a description of what Jesus is doing, and then we learn about the role of compassion in what Jesus is doing and the need for more workers. Chapter 10 is Jesus commissioning and sending his disciples. And here I've broken this into two pieces: Jesus preparing his disciples, then Jesus sending his disciples. Again, I've only asked you to do an outline too deep or a chart too deep for this class, but notice I have added some more detail. That's simply because of how broad that second main unit is in chapter 10, the way I've analyzed it, where Jesus sends out his disciples from verse 5 to 42. So I've gone ahead and broken that down into three more sub-units, and then even gone to a fourth level for 5b all the way through 42. Then I've also broken off verse 11:1. Perhaps could have left that on the second unit, but that is a conclusion where we see, again, a repeat of what Jesus is doing. So notice that the ministry of Jesus frames what the disciples are going to do. Then for some structures. Now that we have the outline of that, we can look at structural relationships. And the structures that I've identified are the big one, causation. Unit 1 and Unit 2 are linked via causation. Jesus' compassion serves as the cause for Jesus' commissioning and sending of his disciples. Then I've gone ahead and asked questions. Again, notice all three types of questions. We have a definitional question: what specifically is involved in the compassion of Jesus? How does this serve as the cause for the calling and sending of the disciples? How does the role of the disciples, or the commissioning of the disciples, how does that flow from Jesus' compassion? Those are three definitional questions. Then I have a rational why this causation, and then what are the implications. In other structures, preparation, realization. Jesus' commissioning of his disciples then serves as an introduction to what we're going to see in the rest of chapter 10. I'm not going to read all the questions here, but you can follow along and you can look at the notes separately. Throughout this passage, there's a recurrence of biographical comparison with an inclusio. Notice, if we frame this out, we have the ministry of Jesus, 9:35 to 38, then the ministry of the disciples, and then the ministry of Jesus. That invites us to compare what Jesus commissions his disciples to do with what Jesus himself was doing. A third structure would be, or a fourth structure in this case, would be particularization. 10:5 is a general statement. It's describing Jesus sending out his disciples, and then the fact of that sending out is laid out, the content in detail, in the rest of chapter 10. We also can see a causation with both contrast and climax. 5b to 15, we see the sending out of the disciples and the description of their ministry, which is going to be very much like Jesus' ministry, and that creates a contrasting effect of a negative response, and we will talk about this in the interpretation Notice the overwhelming amount is the negative response, but then the text ends with a promise of a positive response in verses 40 to 42, which I think would serve as the climax. Okay, we've done structure. Now we look for strategic areas. Notice here I've listed 5 small sections, and each structure that I've described above is represented in one of these strategic areas. And then the last element that we add would be a literary form, which is both prose, and then we have a discursive section. The atmosphere, very serious. Then I have a few other comments. But now let's look at the sample of interpretation, and let me just kind of show you how I've laid this out quickly. You can read through this. I want you to note how I move from survey to interpretation by means of using questions that I raised during the survey. And then what that allows me to do then is focus a detailed observation around attempting to answer questions that I've already raised. If you have some questions about detailed observation and how it fits in with survey, I'm going to do a separate video on that in a couple of minutes that'll be available, and you can check that one out as well. But essentially, the key to interpretation is you want to start with a question or questions. These, again, flow specifically out of the structures that I've identified earlier. And then I set up a research agenda. I'm going to look at the immediate context, the segment context. Immediate context is going to be 9:35 to 38. The segment context, and then broader book. Those are 3 levels of context that you always want to use in your work. Then I'm going to add a section of scriptural testimony, word usage, and then, of course, interpretation of others. Remember, for your work, to get a passing grade, you have to always use context, these 3 levels, and the interpretation of others. So make sure you're adding that as we move forward in our work. So let's start with context. And again, I don't want to just simply read through my observations, but note how I do this. I've asked questions, and now I'm going to go through and look carefully at that immediate context of 9:35 to 38 and reflect on some of this, on some of the text here. I note that the scope of Jesus' ministry is inclusive in terms of Israelite towns and villages. That's a reference back to 9:35, noting the use of all. But I'm also aware from the wider segment that there's going to be some self-imposed limits on that. Implication, Jesus has a huge amount of territory to cover and work to do. Again, make an observation, and then in interpretation, you want to begin to make implications that can serve as answers to some of these questions. Again, Jesus moves about the land. Jesus does not stay in one place. Again, implication is that movements implicit in compassion, movements implicit in ministry. Again, note how I'm making observations about the text, drawing inferences. And make sure that as you do your work, you're writing lots of making lots of observations directly from the text. There's a tendency to try to import theology. Only let the text say what it wants to say. Don't make the text say something else. Make sure your observations are statements of essentially fact that essentially no literate person would be able to object to, and then draw inferences from that. So I do a good little block of observations and inferences through here. Don't be satisfied with only doing a few. Make sure you do a good number of observations. Then I summarize my work here. And now I'm going to move to word uses, because there's a key word here. It's compassion. What's compassion mean? I've located that word. I've found the Greek word. And I've noted that it's used 5 times in Matthew's gospel, and that includes 4 other contexts from here. Notice what I do. I go to those passages and I look at the text and try to understand, what does compassion mean here? And I make some observations about that. And I draw some conclusions. In all these contexts, Jesus, or the master in the parable, feels compassion for others in the face of a need and acts to bring wholeness, salvation. Implicit in this term is the need to act, and it appears to be the decisive motivating factor in the action. In terms of our study, compassion becomes the reason for Jesus' calling and the sending of his disciples. Perhaps compassion is the main motivation for all ministry by followers of Jesus. Then I do some scriptural testimony. I'm looking at other places in the scripture where there's texts about shepherds and make some observations from that. And then I do a review of some commentaries, and this you can look at my notes here, how I'm interacting with these commentaries. It's not long, but I make some comments. Again, summarize your work at the end, and here's my final summary. I have a 7-point summary of what is involved in Jesus' compassion and how that works out. And this would be, again, a summary of a study. Again, this is just one way to do IBS, but I want you to note that I move from section to section. I keep sections separate so I can see the different types of evidence that I use, always starting and emphasizing context and adding other determinants of meaning to flesh things out. Last determinant that you use are going to be resources of others, and then write up a final summary that captures your findings.